Welcome to SnoozyTor. Tonight, let your mind drift beyond the noise of the world, into a place where even silence had a heartbeat. This is the story of the Camp of Silent Hearts, a world of snow and steel, where men were stripped of names, warmth, and freedom, but never their humanity. You'll walk with them through the frozen nights of the Gulag, hear their whispers, feel their small acts of kindness, and discover that even in the darkest place on earth, light can still survive. So take a deep breath, close your eyes, let the rhythm of their story carry you through the cold and into the quiet truth of being human. Because tonight, we remember those who refused to let silence win. The train stopped without warning. No whistle, no announcement, only the grinding of steel echoing across an endless white plain. For a moment, I thought we had reached the edge of the world. Then I saw the guards rise, the dogs strain at their leashes, and the snow begin to swallow our footprints before they even formed. They called it Vernashka, though no such name existed on any map. A place where the wind never stopped moving, where the horizon seemed carved from frozen glass. We stumbled out of the wagons, blinking at the pale sky, our breath already crystallizing into dust. Somewhere behind me, a man coughed blood into the snow. No one looked back. Looking back was dangerous. It reminded you there had been a before. They lined us up, counted us, shouted numbers as if we were crates instead of men. My name was the first thing they took from me. It happened so quickly, so quietly. A guard handed me a thin piece of tin with a number etched onto it, 4217. He hung it around my neck, and for a second I almost laughed. It was absurd to imagine that a life could be reduced to 4 digits. Then he struck me across the mouth for smiling. The laughter froze before it could leave my throat. We walked for hours. The camp appeared at last, rising from the white like a disease. Rows of wooden barracks, their roofs sagging under heavy snow. Watchtowers standing like blind sentinels. Barbed wire glittered faintly, cruel as jewelry. Beyond it, the tundra stretched forever, a silence so vast it felt like punishment itself. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and a strange sourness that clung to the walls. A single stove glowed weakly in the corner. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, hollow, watchful, not unfriendly but emptied of anything human. One man made room on the plank beside him. "New?" he asked. I nodded. He studied my face for a moment, then looked away. In this place, names were dangerous, conversation a kind of currency too valuable to spend. That night I didn't sleep. I lay listening to the rhythm of breathing around me, wheezing, shallow, fragile. The wind howled through cracks in the walls, sounding almost like voices. I wondered if the snow could remember the ones who had come before us, swallowed and forgotten. Did the wind whisper their names as it passed over their graves? Or had even memory frozen here, locked beneath the ice? When morning came, we were herded to the work detail. The sun barely touched the sky, a faint wound behind a wall of clouds. They gave us tools too heavy for our frozen hands. We worked until our shadows disappeared. No one spoke. The guards preferred it that way. But as I struck the frozen earth again and again, I began to understand the rhythm of this place. Not just the cruelty, but the quiet beneath it. A place designed to erase, yet somehow still echoing with life. That night, lying on the same plank, I traced my number in the frost on the wall, 4217. The digits glimmered faintly in the dim light, like a poor imitation of a name. For the first time since my arrest, I whispered to myself, my real name, the one I'd been forbidden to speak. The sound of it filled the small space like a spark. It felt dangerous, wholly alive. I fell asleep holding that name in my mouth like a secret prayer. Perhaps that's how survival begins, not with strength or hope, but with the refusal to forget who you are, even when the world commands silence. They told us the numbers were for order, for efficiency, but I think they were meant for erasure. Every morning we stood in the yard, rows of gray figures under a pale, indifferent sky. The guards barked our numbers as if summoning ghosts. 4217. I learned to answer before my mind had time to remember that the voice they called didn't belong to me. Each shout cut another thread between who I was and who I had been. After the first week, I stopped expecting anyone to use my real name. Even inside the barracks, among the men, we spoke to one another by numbers. It became safer that way. Names carried weight. They belonged to the world before fences, before the cold turned breath into glass. Names could betray us, or worse, remind us of things we no longer dared to feel. Still, I couldn't let mine die completely. Each night, when the lights went out, I whispered it into the darkness. Sometimes I imagined my voice traveling through the cracks in the wall, through the snow, out into the wide frozen night, searching for anyone who might still remember me. Was it foolish? Perhaps. But here, even foolishness was a kind of rebellion. The older prisoners moved with mechanical precision, their faces like stone worn smooth by the wind. They had learned the rhythm of survival. Never speak first, never stand out, never hope too loudly. Yet, in quiet moments, I caught glimpses of something else in them, a flicker behind the eyes like embers buried beneath ash. Humanity refusing to go out. One evening, during roll call, the guard misread the list. He called my number twice, skipping another man's. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush breath. The missing man, a carpenter from Odessa, raised his hand slowly. "I am here," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. The guard's fist struck his face so hard I heard the crack of bone. "Your number is here when I call it," the guard spat. The carpenter fell into the snow, blood blooming bright against the white. No one moved. No one dared. The world narrowed to the rhythm of counting. That night, as we lay in the dark, the carpenter's friend whispered to him through swollen lips, "You still have your name, don't you?" He nodded weakly, and for a moment I saw something defiant in his eyes. Not rage, not despair, but recognition. The quiet kind that says, "I'm still here." The next morning, I saw him washing his face with snow outside the barack. His nose bent, blood crusted along his cheek, but he looked strangely peaceful. He caught me watching and said softly, "Remember your name. That's all they can't take." Then he walked away before the guards noticed we'd spoken. I carried those words with me all day, repeating them silently with each swing of the pickaxe. Remember your name. By nightfall, I carved the initials of my real name into the underside of my bunk with a piece of coal. A secret no one would see, but one that would not be forgotten. Here, survival was not about food or warmth. It was about memory, the fragile bridge between the person the world had erased and the one who refused to vanish. Each time I whispered my name, it felt less like nostalgia and more like defiance. A small rebellion against the silence. Winter arrived long before the calendar admitted it. The air turned to glass, the ground to iron. Even breath seemed to freeze midair before falling like dust. Work never stopped, not for cold, not for hunger, not even for death. The camp believed in production. We were its fuel. Each morning, the siren shrieked us awake. We stumbled into darkness, guided only by the pale glow of snow. The tools, pickaxes, shovels, hammers, lay scattered like bones at the gate. I learned quickly that touching metal with bare hands meant pain sharp enough to make you forget language. Gloves were a luxury. Fingers blackened, split, bled, then simply stopped feeling. We mined frozen earth that refused to yield. The guards shouted, the dogs barked, but the soil itself was our true enemy, silent, merciless, eternal. Sometimes, when my pick struck stone and the sound echoed back from the cavern walls, it almost resembled music. A dirge, perhaps, for the living. Hunger became a constant companion. The rations were small and mean, thin soup, a scrap of bread. You learned to chew slowly, to let each bite melt on your tongue as if pretending it was more. Men argued in whispers about food they would never see again. Roasted potatoes, black bread, sweet milk. I kept quiet. Talking about food felt like describing ghosts. The nights were worse. The barracks turned into tombs of steam and frost. Men huddled together like animals, chasing warmth that never came. Sometimes someone wouldn't wake in the morning. No one spoke about it. The dead were carried out silently before roll call, leaving behind the shape of their body impressed in straw. I tried to remember what winter used to mean, fireplaces, oranges, my mother's knitted scarves. But memory was dangerous. It could melt you from the inside. So I buried mine beneath layers of frost and exhaustion, pretending I had forgotten. Yet sometimes, when the moonlight hit the snow just right, the old world returned, faint, golden, impossible. One evening, during a rare break, I sat near the fence watching the sky bruise into purple. The cold burned through my coat, but the silence felt almost holy. A prisoner named Mikhail sat beside me, his breath trembling in the air. "You count the days?" he asked. "At first," I said. "Then I stopped." He nodded. "Good. Counting makes you think time still belongs to you." We sat like that until the guards shouted us back inside. Before leaving, Mikhail murmured, "When you can't feel your hands anymore, it means you're halfway through the winter. The rest is memory." He smiled, not with his lips but with his eyes, and vanished into the darkness. That night I couldn't sleep. I traced the frost on the window, tiny crystals forming constellations only I could see. Somewhere far away, the world still moved. Trains, cities, people unaware that we were frozen in time beneath the northern lights. And yet, within that stillness, something inside me refused to die. Perhaps it was foolish hope. Or perhaps it was the simple knowledge that each breath, no matter how shallow, still defied the silence they wanted from us. I turned my face toward the wall and whispered, "I'm still here." The words fogged the wood, then faded. But I knew they lingered in the cold air, invisible, waiting to be remembered. It began with a piece of bread. Small, hard, no larger than my palm, yet in this place it might as well have been a miracle. That evening, after a shift so long it felt like time itself had frozen, I returned to the barack barely aware of my own body. My hands were cracked open, my skin raw from the wind. I lay down without undressing, too tired to care. That's when I felt it, something under my pillow wrapped in a scrap of cloth. For a moment I thought it was a mistake. But when I unwrapped it, there it was. A piece of bread, still faintly warm as if touched recently by life. I sat up, looking around. No one met my eyes. Every man was turned toward the wall, pretending to sleep. Yet I knew, someone had seen me stumble today, had watched me fall behind, had chosen to share what little they had. In a world where stealing a crumb meant death, giving one away was an act of rebellion. I didn't eat it at once. I broke off a small piece and let it dissolve slowly on my tongue. The taste, rough, sour, heavy with yeast, carried more meaning than any feast I could remember. It tasted like defiance, like kindness surviving under ice. I ate half, saved half. That night, I lay awake thinking about the unseen hand that had left it. Perhaps it was Mikhail. Or maybe the silent carpenter. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had chosen generosity over survival. And in doing so, they reminded me that I was still part of something larger than myself. A quiet network of human hearts that refused to stop beating. In the morning, as we marched toward the mines, I saw a young man, barely 18, trembling at the edge of the line. His clothes hung loose, his fingers blue with cold. He looked exactly as I must have looked a month ago, when I still believed there was a way out of this place. Without thinking, I slipped my mittens off and pushed them into his hands. He stared at me in disbelief, his eyes wide, wet, terrified. "Take them," I whispered. He nodded once, clutching them as if afraid they might vanish. Later, when the guards weren't watching, he looked back and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Maybe thank you, maybe I owe you. But the words didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth that spread through me, faint but real. The same warmth I had felt the night before when I tasted the bread. That evening, Mikhail leaned close as we ate our rations. "I saw what you did," he murmured. "That's how it starts." "How what starts?" "The circle," he said. "One gives, another remembers. That's how we stay human." He was right. In the days that followed, I began to notice more small gestures. A piece of coal shared between bunkmates, a spoon of soup slipped to a sick man, a shoulder offered to someone too weak to stand. Tiny acts that meant nothing to the guards but everything to us. The system wanted us to fight for scraps, to see one another as competition. Instead, we began to weave an invisible thread of compassion through the cold. A thread thin as hair but unbreakable. I finished the last piece of bread 3 nights later. By then it had turned dry and hard as wood. Still, I ate it slowly, closing my eyes, tasting not the bread itself but what it meant. Someone had remembered me. And now I was remembering them. Perhaps that was the only kind of immortality this place allowed, to pass a fragment of kindness forward, one crumb at a time. The boy's name was Luka. I learned it days later, whispered between shifts, as though names themselves were contraband. He was from Georgia, barely more than a child, his voice still trembling like the wind through wire. When I gave him my mittens, I thought I was giving away warmth. But what I gave him, I would soon realize, was something else. Permission to hope. The mittens were crude things, stitched from scraps of old blankets and rope thread. They weren't worth much. But in this place, anything that stood between skin and cold was treasure. My fingers burned without them. By the end of the first hour, the skin split. By noon, I could no longer feel them at all. Still, every time I saw Luka in the distance, his hands wrapped tight in those ugly gray mittens, I felt something in me thaw. He smiled once, across the yard, barely visible through the snowfall. The gesture lasted no longer than a breath, but it stayed with me all night. That evening, while the guard's boots faded down the corridor, I heard soft movement near my bunk. Luca pressed something into my hand. I felt it before I saw it, rough cloth folded small. Inside was a fragment of potato, thin as a coin. "It's from the kitchen," he whispered. They threw the peel away. I stared at the gift, absurdly moved. He had risked punishment, maybe worse, for a sliver of peel. For me, I didn't eat it. I couldn't. I kept it hidden beneath my blanket until morning, as if the act itself could warm the air around me. In the weeks that followed, small exchanges like that became the pulse of the camp. No speeches, no plans, just quiet generosity passed from hand to hand. A word, a glance, a stolen crumb. The guards didn't see it, or maybe they didn't understand. You can't patrol something invisible. Mikhail once said, "They want us to become beasts. Compete, hoard, bite to survive. But beasts don't share. Beasts don't remember." He was right. Every time one of us gave instead of taking, it was like striking a match in a cavern. The flame was small, yes, but in the dark, even a spark could light 1,000 eyes. Luca changed after that. He stood straighter at roll call, coughed less, even hummed sometimes while we worked. Once, I heard him whisper to another prisoner. He gave me mittens. And the other man, a silent, stone-faced miner, nodded slowly as though those words meant more than any sermon. Winter deepened. The days blurred. The guards grew harsher, the cold sharper. But inside, something fragile was taking shape, an unspoken covenant among us. We had nothing, yet we gave. We were dying, yet we chose to act as if life still mattered. Sometimes, when my hands ached and my breath froze in my beard, I would think of Luca's small smile, of the potato peel hidden under my blanket, of the mittens now torn and blackened, still wrapped around his hands. And I would remember that the warmth I lost from my fingers had found its way somewhere else. That was the first lesson the camp taught me, that survival alone is not victory. To stay alive is one thing. To stay human, that is the greater struggle. The first time I heard the music, I thought I was dreaming. It was long after curfew, when even the wind seemed too tired to move. The barracks slept in restless silence, the kind that comes from hunger more than exhaustion. I lay awake, staring at the frost patterns crawling along the beams above me, when a faint vibration reached my ears. At first, I mistook it for the hum of the stove, or the murmuring of men half asleep. But then it grew, low, trembling, deliberate. A melody. Someone was playing. I sat up slowly, careful not to creak the boards. The sound came from beyond the thin wall that separated our barack from the carpenter's workshop. It was fragile, imperfect, but unmistakably music. A stringed instrument played with fingers too numb for grace yet steady with devotion. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The air itself held its breath. Later, I would learn that the instrument was no real violin at all, but something born of desperation. Wood carved from a broken stool, strings made from mine wire, glue boiled from fish bones. Its creator was a Ukrainian prisoner named Oleg, who had once played in a village orchestra before being condemned here for bourgeois sentiment. The melody he played that night was a lullaby, simple, mournful, the kind mothers hum to children when words fail. No one dared to applaud. But one by one, men stirred, listening in silence, faces turned toward the sound as if toward sunlight. For the first time in months, I forgot where I was. I forgot the fences, the numbers, the ache in my hands. There was only the trembling voice of that makeshift violin, rising through the cracks of the barracks and out into the frozen night. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt sacred. Then, from the other end of the room, a voice began to hum, low at first, uncertain. Another joined, then another. Within minutes, the darkness itself seemed to sing. No words, no rhythm, only a trembling harmony, fragile as candlelight. The guards never knew. Or maybe they did and chose to ignore it. Perhaps even they, for one night, wanted to believe we were still human. In the dim light, I saw Luca sitting on his bunk, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Afterward, when the barack returned to its quiet breathing, he whispered, "Do you think God heard us?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Then I said, "If he didn't, maybe the snow did." He smiled faintly, a soundless laugh that seemed to float in the cold air. The next evening, Oleg played again. And the night after that. Soon, men began to bring him gifts. Bits of cloth, scraps of bread, anything they could spare. He refused most of it, saying only, "Keep your food. Just listen." The guards called it the noise from the carpenter's hut. We called it the choir. Each time the music began, something inside us stirred. A reminder that beauty could exist even here, where beauty had no right to be. It wasn't rebellion in the way the guards imagined. It was something purer, the refusal to let the world become only suffering. One night, Oleg played until his fingers bled. When he finished, he whispered, "They can have my body, not my song." I never forgot those words. That winter, the cold claimed many of us. But not all deaths were the same. Some men froze as prisoners. Others, those who sang, who listened, froze as men still free inside. It started with a question whispered in the dark. "Were you really a teacher?" The voice came from somewhere above me, Mikhail's bunk. I hesitated before answering. Here, truth was a dangerous thing. But then I said quietly, "Yes, literature. In another life." He didn't respond. The silence stretched until I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then came his voice again, even softer. "Teach us." At first I laughed, quietly, bitterly. "Teach what?" "We have no paper, no books, no chalk." "Teach from memory," he said. "The guards can't search your mind." That night, lying in the stale air of the barack, I tried to recall the lessons I had once given. My students' faces blurred, their laughter fading behind years of frost. But the words were still there. Pushkin, Tolstoy, Chekhov, their lines came back like old friends finding their way through the snow. The next evening, after lights out, 3 men gathered near my bunk. No one spoke at first. The risk was too great. Discovery meant punishment, maybe worse. But when I began to whisper the opening lines of the Bronze Horseman, something changed. Their breathing slowed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Soon others joined. A doctor who had forgotten his own voice recited poetry in Latin. A railway engineer taught arithmetic on the back of a tin plate using a stick of charcoal. A linguist began giving German lessons between work shifts, tracing letters with his finger on the snow. It became our secret university, invisible, forbidden, yet alive. Knowledge passed from mind to mind like smuggled treasure. No one could confiscate it, no one could destroy it. Sometimes during our lessons I would catch a glimpse of something rare, joy. Not the kind that laughs, but the kind that remembers. We were no longer prisoners then, but students, hungry, curious, human. Once a young man asked me, "Why learn anything here? We'll never use it." I looked at him and said, "Because remembering is resistance. Because forgetting is what they want." He nodded slowly as if hearing something sacred. As weeks passed, the lessons grew bolder. We spoke of history, of art, of the old world, of everything that once made life feel whole. I saw light return to eyes that had been empty for too long. Even the guards, perhaps unknowingly, became part of our rhythm. When their boots faded down the corridor, our words would rise like smoke, soft, careful, unkillable. One night, during a whispered discussion about poetry, someone asked, "Do you think words can survive this place?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Words survive us all," I said. "They lived before us. They will live after. Our task is only to keep them warm until the world needs them again." That night, as snow drifted through the cracks in the wall, I realized what teaching had truly given me. Not power, not hope, but memory, the most fragile and the most defiant form of freedom. In the darkness, I could almost hear my old classroom again. Chalk scraping against a board, voices reading in unison, sunlight spilling through tall windows. It was far away, yes, but not lost. As long as we remembered, even faintly, we were not entirely gone. I closed my eyes and whispered a line I had once taught to children long before the camp. "There is no prison for the soul that remembers beauty." And for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of cold. His name was Pavel. He was a bootmaker, or had been once. Now he mended the same pair of prison boots over and over, their soles thinner with each winter. The guards thought of him as a craftsman, useful and harmless. They were half right. I met him one evening when I was assigned to help in the repair workshop, a dim, smoky hut that smelled of leather, glue, and quiet despair. Pavel worked alone, his movements slow but sure, his one leg braced against a wooden stool. I noticed the precision in his hands, the tenderness with which he touched each torn seam. After a while, he said without looking up, "You were the one teaching poetry, weren't you?" My heart skipped. "Who told you that?" He smiled faintly. The wind carries things. Don't worry, the wind here forgets as easily as it remembers. We worked in silence for a long time. Then I saw what he was really making. Under the bench, hidden beneath scraps of torn leather, lay a flat piece of boot lining, but it wasn't a boot. It was a map. Tiny lines stitched with thread. A river, a cathedral, a street I once knew. Moscow. He noticed me staring and said quietly, "For my son. When I get out, I'll show him where I used to live. Where his mother and I met. Where the pigeons gathered at dawn." His voice cracked slightly on that last word. I couldn't speak. Every line on that map was an act of defiance, a way of saying, "I remember." It wasn't a map for escape. It was a map for memory, a map for the soul. "You could be punished for this," I whispered. He nodded. Then they'd know it mattered. Each night after work he added another stitch, a park, a bridge, a window. He used boot blacking for shadows, thread from stolen uniforms for streets. The longer I watched, the more the map came alive. It wasn't perfect, but it breathed. It was Moscow as seen through love, not the Moscow of politics or parades, but of bread ovens, rivers, and laughter. One night, I asked him why he risked so much for something no one might ever see. He smiled, eyes glinting like candlelight behind frost. "Because they can take my body," he said softly, "but not where my heart lives." When it was finished, he rolled the map carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into the hollow of his wooden leg. "Someday," he whispered, "I'll walk this city again." He didn't. Pavel died that winter, pneumonia they said. The guards took his leg for burning, unaware of the treasure hidden inside. But someone, I never knew who, retrieved the map before it vanished. 4 weeks afterward, whispers spread through the camp. They burned the man, but the city survived. And it did. The map passed from hand to hand like a holy relic. Sometimes in the barack after lights out, someone would unroll it carefully and trace the stitched streets with a fingertip. No one spoke. It was enough just to look, to know that somewhere beyond the fences, life still existed in color. I think of that map often, of the way it glowed faintly in the candlelight, of the way it reminded us all that memory could be drawn, stitched, carried, even smuggled through the darkest places. And sometimes when I dream of freedom, it isn't escape I see. It's Pavel's map, spreading quietly across the snow, the thread still warm from his hands. Faith was forbidden in Vornashka. The Soviets called it superstition, a sickness of the old world. But the longer I stayed there, the more I realized, even in a place built to kill the soul, people will still pray. It began with the old priest, Father Sergei. He was a small man with a beard gone white as frost, his hands trembling so badly that even the guards mocked him for it. They thought he was harmless. They were wrong. The first time I saw him, he was mending a torn blanket by the stove. His eyes were steady, quiet, the color of ashes. When he spoke, it was never about God. He talked about warmth, about patience, about snow melting eventually. But at night, after curfew, men began to slip away one by one, always toward the latrines, the one place the guards avoided. I followed them once. Inside, the air was foul, the walls sweating frost. And yet, there they were. 24 men standing shoulder to shoulder in the half-dark. And in the center, Father Sergei. He wasn't wearing robes. There was no altar, no icons, no candles. Only a bucket turned upside down, and the faint smell of disinfectant. But his voice, soft, cracked, almost broken, filled that space like light. "God sees us here," he said quietly. "Even in this place. Perhaps especially in this place." No one knelt. No one dared close their eyes. We prayed standing, hands hidden inside our sleeves, lips barely moving. It was less a ritual than an act of remembrance, not of religion, but of humanity. I wasn't a believer, not before and not then. But when I heard those words, that God might see us, I felt something shift. Not faith perhaps, but the idea that somewhere beyond this endless snow, there was still meaning. After the service, a man beside me whispered, "Why risk this? If they find out." The priest smiled gently. "They will, eventually. But the soul grows weaker when it forgets how to speak." He was right. Each whispered prayer was a rebellion, not against the guards, but against forgetting, against the silence they wanted to bury us in. The next week I returned, and again the week after that. Sometimes there were only 5 of us, sometimes 20. Each time, the same fragile voice carried through the darkness. When rations were cut, the priest divided his bread among the sick. When frostbite claimed his fingers, he still traced the cross in the air, invisible but felt by all. Once I asked him quietly, "Do you still believe after all this?" He smiled, eyes closed. "Belief isn't the question," he said. "The question is whether love still exists. If love exists, then God has not left." After that night, I stopped trying to define faith. I only knew that when we stood together in that freezing latrine, whispering words we barely remembered, something larger than the camp seemed to breathe among us. When Father Sergei died that spring, the guards buried him beyond the fence, nameless, numberless. But we remembered. Every Sunday after roll call, a few of us would glance toward the hills and whisper the same words. God sees us here, even in this place. And for a few seconds, the air would feel lighter, as if the snow itself were listening. You wouldn't expect laughter to survive here. Not in a place where silence was law and death was routine. But somehow it did. It began one morning at roll call when a guard slipped on the ice. He fell, hard, his hat flying off, his rifle clattering into the snow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world froze with him. Then from somewhere in the line came a sound, small, stifled, impossible. A laugh. It spread like a spark. A breath, a snort, a cough disguised as a chuckle. The guard sprang up, red-faced, furious. But it was too late. For a single second, the entire camp was breathing in unison. Not fear, not pain, but amusement. And in that brief, dangerous moment, we remembered what it felt like to be human. Afterward, the laughter lingered, quiet but contagious. It hid in whispered jokes about rations, about the endless speeches praising the glorious workers' paradise. When the political officer announced that our labor was the pride of the motherland, someone muttered, "Then mother must be blind." No one dared laugh aloud, but shoulders shook silently across the yard. This was no cheerful laughter. It was sharp, cracked like glass breaking. A kind of madness, perhaps, but it kept us sane. Mikhail was the best at it. He could turn misery into irony with a glance. When the guards announced improved living conditions, he looked around our half-collapsed barack and said, "I can see the improvement already. More holes mean better ventilation." Even the frost couldn't freeze the smirks that followed. Once, he told me quietly, "You know why jokes matter here?" I shook my head. Because laughter means you still see the absurdity. Once you stop laughing, it means the world has made sense to you, and that's when it's won. He was right. Even gallows humor was a form of clarity. To laugh was to admit that the system's logic, its cruelty, its rules, its lies, was ridiculous. That truth itself had not died, only hidden behind a smirk. The guards had their own kind of irony too. One evening, the political officer gathered us all for a motivational lecture. He read from a paper, his voice flat and proud. "Comrade Stalin sends his regards. He hopes you are enjoying your rehabilitation." We stood there, covered in soot, our hands bleeding, our breath freezing midair. And somewhere deep inside me something cracked. Not from sadness, but from disbelief so deep it turned to laughter. Not loud, not disrespectful. Just quiet, shaking, uncontrollable laughter at the sheer absurdity of it all. That night in the barack, Mikhail leaned over and said, "If you can still laugh, you're still alive." He meant it. And I realized then that laughter, like kindness, was another kind of bread, shared in secret, sustaining us one breath at a time. Over time, the jokes grew darker. When a man died of exhaustion, someone would mutter, "Lucky. He got early release." We'd laugh softly, not because it was funny, but because it was unbearable not to. Even Luca, young, gentle Luca, began to understand. One evening, as we huddled for warmth, he said with a crooked smile, "Do you think they'll ever run out of prisoners?" Mikhail answered, "Not until they start arresting themselves." And for the first time, even I laughed aloud. The sound startled me, a noise I hadn't made in months. It was rusty, painful, but it was mine. For a moment, the camp felt lighter. The frost retreated from our hearts. And in that strange, fragile joy, I understood what laughter truly was. Not escape, but endurance. Not denial, but defiance. Because even here, in the place of silence and death, we still found ways to laugh at the empire that wanted to crush us. And that meant, if only for a heartbeat, that it hadn't yet succeeded. It began quietly, the way most tragedies do. A cough. a shiver that wouldn't go away. By the third night, Mikhail's skin burned with fever. The official procedure was clear: report him to the infirmary. But everyone knew what that meant. The infirmary was where men went to disappear. They entered breathing and left as smoke. We couldn't let that happen. When the guards finished roll call and the barack settled into silence, I went to Mikhail's bunk. His face was pale beneath the sweat, his breath shallow and quick. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just tired." His voice cracked on the last word. Luka appeared beside me, holding a rag soaked in snowmelt. He pressed it gently to Mikhail's forehead. "Don't talk," Luka said. "Save your strength." We weren't doctors. We had no medicine, no thermometer, no bandages. Only what the camp allowed us to steal: a handful of snow, a torn blanket, a cup of hot water bribed from the kitchen worker with a day's worth of bread. Taurus, the broad-shouldered miner from Ukraine, traded his tobacco ration for more hot water. Rain, the Estonian clerk, gave up his mittens to keep Mikhail's chest warm. Even the quiet barber, who never spoke above a whisper, offered to cut the wool lining from his cap to wrap around Mikhail's feet. It wasn't much, but in a place where men killed for a crust of bread, it was everything. We took turns sitting with him through the night. When he moaned, we wiped his forehead with snow. When he trembled, we held him steady. When he stopped breathing for a second too long, we counted the beats until the next breath came. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the barack glowed faintly from the dying fire, a single ember fighting a sea of darkness. Hours blurred. I remembered Taurus humming softly, a song from his village. Luka murmured a prayer under his breath. I whispered lines from Pushkin, though I could barely remember the words. We weren't saving him, not really. We were saving what he meant to us. By dawn, the fever broke. His breathing steadied, his eyes opened. He looked at us, all of us, and smiled weakly. "This," he whispered, "this is how we win." None of us answered. We didn't need to, because we knew he was right. Not by escaping, not by surviving our sentences, but by refusing to become what they wanted, beasts clawing at one another for scraps. That morning, as the guards shouted for roll call, Mikhail managed to stand, leaning on Taurus's arm. His steps were slow, uncertain. But every man in our group moved closer, creating a wall around him, a silent circle of protection. No one spoke. No one looked at the guards. But for the first time, I felt something close to pride. When we returned to work, I caught myself thinking of the night before, of the snow, the whispered voices, the heat of shared breath. And I realized, that night we hadn't been prisoners. We'd been men. Later, Mikhail told me, they can't record this victory. It doesn't fit in their reports. I smiled faintly. Then we'll keep it for ourselves. And we did. For weeks afterward, every time one of us fell ill, the others would sit through the night, watching, waiting, remembering that once, in the heart of winter, a man had lived because we refused to let him die. We never called it rebellion. That word didn't belong to us. Rebellion meant guns, slogans, banners, things made for the outside world. What we had were smaller, quieter, but no less dangerous. They began as habits. A few seconds stolen here and there from the rhythm of obedience. A shovel moved slower. A song hummed under breath. A glance exchanged when no one was watching. To the guards, it was nothing. To us, it was everything. In the mines, we learned to communicate without words. A shift of the shoulder meant foreman ahead. 2 knocks of a pickaxe meant danger. A small gesture toward the wall meant stop digging, the roof is weak. We built our own language, silent and efficient, invisible under their eyes. Knowledge became our weapon. We learned how to meet quotas with less effort, how to rest without appearing lazy, how to share warmth without attracting attention. When a new prisoner arrived, we taught him the signals, the patterns, the rhythm of survival. In that way, our defiance spread, not as fire, but as roots beneath frozen ground. Even humor became strategy. When a guard barked an order, someone would deliberately misunderstand it. If they said faster, we'd nod earnestly, then slow down, carefully, precisely, too subtle to punish. When they shouted work harder, we worked longer but not better. Their frustration became our quiet joy. Taurus once called it the art of staying alive while saying no. And it was art, delicate, dangerous, beautiful. I remember one morning when the quota demanded 15 carts of ore. We filled exactly 14 and a half. Not more. Not less. That half cart, that missing measure of obedience, was a message written in silence. The guards yelled, threatened, even beat one of us. But the next day the same thing happened. And the next. They could never quite prove it was deliberate. But we knew. And that knowledge made the air feel a little warmer. We even created our own justice. When a thief stole from another prisoner, we handled it ourselves, quietly, without the administration. A whispered warning, a missing ration, a cold shoulder. It wasn't cruelty, it was order. Our order. Sometimes I wondered if this was what freedom looked like. Not open fields or unlocked gates, but the ability to act, however slightly, against what tried to erase you. One night, Mikhail said, "We can't win here." I nodded. "No. But we can choose how we lose." He smiled at that. "Exactly. And that choice is victory enough." Even the smallest acts, a stolen pause, a shared glance, a deliberately slow breath, became reminders that we were still capable of choosing. And choice, in a place built to strip it away, was the purest form of rebellion. That winter, when the guards counted us during roll call, I realized something strange. We looked identical, shaved heads, gray coats, blank faces. But beneath that sameness, we had built an entire secret world. A network of small rebellions no system could measure. They thought we were silent, but they were wrong. We were speaking, in gestures, in glances, in the rhythm of our work. And every act of quiet resistance, every unspoken no, was a sentence in a language of freedom only we could understand. The first time I saw the northern lights, I almost forgot to breathe. It was deep winter, the kind that makes silence feel heavy, solid. We were walking back from the mines, the air so cold it cut the inside of your lungs. And then, without warning, the sky came alive. It began as a shimmer at the edge of the horizon, a pale green ribbon twisting against the stars. Then another joined it, and another, until the whole heavens were moving, glowing, dancing. Waves of light rippled across the black sky, emerald, violet, blue, colors so vivid they made the snow itself seem dull. For a moment, the guards forgot to shout. The dogs stopped barking. Even the wind fell silent. We all stood there, prisoners and guards alike, staring upward like children. No orders, no chains, just light. Luca whispered, "What is it?" "The northern lights," I said softly. "Aurora borealis." He repeated the words as if tasting them. "Aurora," he murmured, smiling faintly. "Sounds like someone's name." It did. A name for something beautiful enough to make even this place seem small. No one spoke for a long time. And when the lights faded at last, I felt an ache that was both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the world we'd lost, gratitude that it still existed somewhere above us. The next morning, something changed in the camp. Men walked a little straighter. Work songs returned, quiet, wordless hums that matched the rhythm of the pickaxes. Even the guards seemed uneasy, as if the light had reminded them of something they'd been trying to forget. After that night, we began to watch the sky. Every evening, when the air turned glass clear, we'd steal glances upward. Sometimes there were stars, bright and sharp as knives. Sometimes only clouds, heavy with snow. And sometimes, if we were lucky, the lights came again, twisting like ghosts above the barbed wire. Rain once said, "Even they can't reach that." He meant the sky. And he was right. The wire could trap our bodies, but not our gaze, not our wonder. The system could command our hours, but not our eyes. One morning, as the sun returned after weeks of darkness, a single bird flew over the camp, a small black silhouette cutting through the white sky. It circled once, twice, then vanished into the clouds. Someone, I think it was Mikhail, whispered, "Freedom's messenger." We laughed quietly. Not mockery, but awe. From that day, I began to look for signs of beauty the way others looked for food. The frost patterns on the baroque walls, like rivers frozen mid-flow. The sound of snow falling so soft it was almost music. The faint blush of sunrise against the ice. Each small miracle became a secret scripture. A promise that the world, for all its cruelty, still contained grace. Even the guards sometimes would pause. Once I caught one of them, a young officer, staring at the horizon, his face open and uncertain. For a moment he looked like any other man, just tired of the cold. Our eyes met. He looked away quickly, but he didn't shout. That night, Lucas said, "Maybe the lights come to remind the sky that we're still here." I wanted to tell him that was foolish, but instead I said, "Maybe you're right," because maybe he was. Maybe the lights weren't just a trick of physics or a dance of solar winds. Maybe they were memory, the earth remembering beauty even when men forgot it. And in that glow, fleeting and pure, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not hope. Something quieter. Something like peace. Hunger ruled everything in Vernashka. It was the clock, the weather, the dream. It decided when we woke, how we worked, what we thought about, what we feared. But there came a point when hunger turned inward, when the body had nothing left to crave and only the mind could feed itself. That was when we began to eat from memory. It started with talk. At first, just words exchanged in the dark. "What did your mother cook on Sundays?" someone asked one night. And suddenly the barak came alive with recipes. A fisherman described borscht so red it glowed like sunset in a bowl. Another man swore nothing on earth could match his wife's rye bread, thick, black, warm from the oven. Luca, with that boyish grin, spoke of lamb stew from Georgia, heavy with herbs and garlic. Even Mikhail, who rarely smiled, told us about tea brewed in samovars that hissed and sang like small dragons. We spoke slowly, carefully, tasting the words as we spoke them. The guards couldn't take that from us. They could starve our stomachs, but not our tongues. When it was my turn, I told them about my grandmother's honey cake. 3 layers of sponge soaked in syrup, covered in crushed walnuts, the air thick with cinnamon. I could almost see her hands again, small, quick, dusted with flour, humming softly as she worked. I described it piece by piece. How the sugar melted into amber. How the cake cooled on the windowsill. How she would tap the edge of the pan with her wedding ring to check if it was ready. The men listened as if I were reading a sacred text. Their eyes closed, their breaths slow, as though each word carried warmth. For a few minutes, we weren't starving prisoners. We were children again, sitting at wooden tables, waiting for supper. When I finished, someone whispered, "Say it again." So I did. And for that night, the barak smelled like home. We called it the Feast of Ghosts. Every evening, after lights out, we'd share a dish from memory, one man's soup, another's bread, someone else's roast potatoes. Each description was a small resurrection. The taste wasn't real, but the comfort was. One night, Rain said quietly, "You think food tastes better in memory or in truth?" Mikhail answered, "In memory. Because there, you never run out." We all laughed softly, a strange laughter, half joy, half ache. Sometimes I imagined cooking for them all when this ended. A long table, candles flickering, the smell of stew and honey and smoke. I promised them, and myself, that I would make that cake again someday. Lucas smiled. "I'll hold you to it." It was foolish, maybe. But in this place, promises were rarer than bread. Even in the worst weeks, when rations grew smaller and men fought for scraps, we still spoke of food. It wasn't torment, it was survival. The act of remembering a meal became an act of rebellion. Because every time we described a flavor, we were reminding ourselves. Once we lived in a world of plenty, of warmth, of taste. And maybe, just maybe, we would again. Sometimes, when the hunger grew unbearable, I'd close my eyes and imagine the honey cake melting on my tongue. Sweet, golden, impossible. The taste would fade quickly, but the feeling stayed. A quiet defiance, baked into memory. Because even when the body forgets, the soul remembers sweetness. The guards called us by numbers. They shouted them across the yard, carved them into our tags, scratched them onto ledgers as if we were inventory. To them, we weren't people. We were entries in a ledger, lines in a system, units of labor. But among ourselves, we began to whisper names again. It happened quietly, almost shyly. One evening after roll call, as we returned to the barak, a new prisoner stumbled in the snow. The guard barked, 4361. Move. The man stood, eyes dull, lips cracked. Later that night, I asked him softly, "What's your real name?" He hesitated before answering. Dmitry Sergeyevich, engineer. Leningrad. When he said it, something changed in his face, the faintest light, as if he'd found a piece of himself buried under frost. I nodded, repeating it quietly. "Good to meet you, Dmitry Sergeyevich." He smiled. A small, trembling smile. No one had used his name in months. After that, others followed. We began asking one another not for numbers, but for who we had been. Professor, doctor, father, poet. Names became sacred currency. They were a way of saying, "You exist. I see you." The administration hated names. They erased them from documents, replaced them with codes. They believed anonymity made us manageable. But the more they insisted on silence, the more stubbornly we remembered. In the barack I could hear them now, the murmurs of identity being rebuilt. Good night, Pavel. Thank you, Luka. Hold on, Mikhail. Each one a soft act of defiance, a whisper of resurrection. Sometimes I'd forget mine, for a second no more. Then someone would say it aloud and it would come back to me like warmth after numbness. Alexander Ivanovich. My name. My father's name. A small flame refusing to die. One night Luka asked, "Why do names matter so much?" I thought for a while before answering. Because they remind us that we're not finished yet. That someone somewhere still knows who we are. He nodded thoughtfully. Like letters waiting to be delivered. Yes, I said. Exactly like that. Sometimes during work detail the guards would shout numbers and we would answer. But under our breath we'd whisper our real names first. A quiet promise to ourselves. 4217. Pause. Alexander. It became a ritual. Every night before sleeping I'd whisper a list. The names of my friends, my family, the men in our circle. Not prayers exactly, but reminders. Each name a heartbeat. Each one keeping the dead from vanishing completely. When a man died, we didn't say his number. We said his name. We remembered his voice, his work, his small habits. The way Taurus hummed, the way Rain folded his hands when he thought, the way Pavel smiled before telling a story. We kept them alive through sound. The guards could take our food, our warmth, our freedom, but they could never erase a name once spoken aloud. Names were echoes the cold couldn't swallow. And in that way, even surrounded by silence, we learned how to keep speaking. It began with a whisper, then a gesture, then a rhythm of sound that wasn't quite speech but wasn't silence either. The longer we lived in Vernashka, the more we realized, to survive here we needed to speak without words. Words could be overheard, twisted, reported. But movement, breath, glances, those could pass unnoticed, carrying meaning like smoke through the cracks. So we built a language. No one decided it. It grew the way frost grows, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look around and everything glitters with it. A hand to the chest meant thank you. A thumb over the shoulder meant guard nearby. A tap on the shovel meant enough for today. Even the silence between us became a kind of speech. We learned to communicate in fragments of rhythm. The scrape of boots, the clink of metal, the pause in a breath. It wasn't only for safety. It was a way to remind one another, I see you. You're not alone. Once, during a blizzard, I slipped on the ice near the mine entrance. A guard shouted for me to get up. Before I could, Taurus reached out a hand, quick, firm, invisible to anyone watching. He said nothing, but the way he gripped my arm told me more than words ever could. In that one touch was everything. Solidarity, warning, care. Language became our shared heartbeat. It crossed borders, erased origins. Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Estonians, men who couldn't understand one another's words still learned the same gestures. We built a vocabulary of survival that belonged to no empire. Sometimes we used humor to disguise meaning. If a foreman approached, someone would murmur, "The moose is coming," and everyone would know to straighten up. If the snow was too loose for digging, we'd say, "The earth is sleeping," and the work would slow. The guards never noticed. They didn't understand that jokes could be code. Luka, clever and young, invented half our signals. He'd test new ones at night, scratching shapes into the frost, teaching us by pantomime. He called it our secret tongue. Once he grinned and said, "When they tell us to be silent, they don't realize silence has many dialects." He was right. Silence had become our rebellion, fluent, precise, unbreakable. One day I created a word of my own. When I wanted to say hope without saying it, I would trace a small circle in the air with my finger. It meant the sun will come again. Lucas saw me do it once and smiled. After that, others began to use it too. Soon, whenever one of us passed another in the snow, we'd draw that small invisible circle, quick, discreet, almost unseen. A promise passed hand to hand through the wind. The guards saw nothing, but we knew we were speaking more than ever. And sometimes I thought perhaps the world beyond the wire spoke too. In the way snow drifted through the barack roof, in the way the aurora shimmered without sound, in the way the frost wrote its patterns on the walls. Maybe everything that couldn't speak in words had its own language too. A language not of orders or propaganda, but of endurance and of quiet love. The longer I lived in that silence, the more fluent I became. It started with a memory, and a voice that refused to stay quiet. The nights in Vernashka were endless. Darkness pressed against the windows like another wall, and silence weighed heavier than chains. We had learned to whisper prayers, to trade gestures, to share food. But the cold still crept into our minds. So one evening, when even the stove had gone out, I began to speak. Not to anyone in particular, just to the dark. I told a story, something simple, something I half remembered from before. A tale about a boy who followed a river to the sea, chasing the sound of bells. I don't know why I chose that one. Maybe because it was about movement, about going somewhere, anywhere, when all we could do was stay. At first, I thought no one was listening. Then, from the shadows, Luca's voice whispered, "And what did he find?" So I kept talking. And when I stopped, there was silence. Not the empty kind, but the full kind. Then another voice said softly, "Tell another." That was how it began. Each night, when the guard's footsteps faded, we gathered around the dying stove. I told stories, sometimes from memory, sometimes invented. The others listened, eyes half closed, as if my words were warmth. We traveled everywhere. To the hills of Georgia, where apricot trees bloomed in spring. To the streets of Moscow before the arrests, where laughter echoed from cafes. To forests where no fences stood and rivers that didn't freeze. Soon they began telling stories too. Mikhail recited Pushkin from memory, his voice gravelly but steady. Rain told us Estonian legends about men who could speak to wolves. Even Taurus, who barely spoke at all, described the sun rising over Ukrainian wheat fields. For a few hours each night, we lived outside Vernashka. Not free, but somewhere freer. One evening, Luca said, "You should write them down when you get out." I laughed quietly. "With what? A stick and snow?" "Then remember them," he said, "so someone else can know." That idea stayed with me. I began memorizing everything I said, every word, every story, building a library inside my skull. No paper, no ink, only breath. It became our new ritual. Each story was a gift, traded for silence and trust. Each one meant we were still capable of imagining something better than this place. The guards never noticed. To them, we were only whispering nonsense. But in truth, we were creating worlds, entire worlds, from scraps of memory and faith. Sometimes, after everyone had fallen asleep, I'd lie awake, staring at the rafters. And I'd think about how strange it was, that in a place designed to destroy thought, we were becoming poets. In a place built for silence, we had learned to speak again. One night, I dreamt of the boy from my first story, the one who followed the river to the sea. He reached it at last, standing barefoot in the surf, the bells ringing somewhere beyond the mist. When I woke, I realized something simple but profound. We weren't just telling stories to pass the time. We were leaving traces, proof that we had existed, that we had dreamed. That morning, as the siren called us to work, Mikhail said, "Your stories, they make the walls softer." And I thought, yes, maybe that's what storytelling truly is, the art of making walls a little less cruel. In Vernashka, death came quietly. No sirens, no ceremony, just a stillness that spread, one bunk at a time, like frost. We had grown used to it, or at least we pretended to. When a man stopped breathing in the night, someone would close his eyes, pull the blanket over his face and whisper his name. By morning, the body would be gone, the bunk filled again by evening. The camp swallowed everything. But some refused to leave in silence. It began with an old Estonian named Arvid. He was small, gentle, his hair white as the snow outside. Tuberculosis had been eating him for months, and by winter's end, it was clear he wouldn't last. Yet every night he still hummed. Softly at first, the kind of humming you mistake for wind, then stronger, deeper. One evening, he asked if anyone remembered the song of his homeland. No one did, so he taught us. The tune was simple, just a few notes, rising and falling like waves. We sang it in whispers, afraid the guards might hear. But the sound grew, filling the dark with something fragile and whole. Arvid smiled through his coughing. "Good," he said. "Now it lives in you." He died that night with the song still on his lips. 4 days afterward, we sang it under our breath. Not loudly, never loudly, but enough that it lingered in the air like smoke that refused to fade. Soon, others followed his example. A miner from Ukraine sang to his son's memory. A doctor from Moscow recited a lullaby for a child he hadn't seen in 12 years. Even Taurus, gruff, wordless Taurus, sang once, low and rough, a melody with no words at all. The dying began leaving songs behind as if they were inheritance. Little fragments of melody traded like bread. When one of them felt the end approaching, he'd call us close, whisper a tune and say, "Sing this when I'm gone so I don't get lost." We did. And somehow those songs, half remembered, half invented, began to weave together. They filled the barracks, the work lines, even the mines. At first, the guards tried to stop it. They barked orders, struck men for humming. But the songs never vanished, they just moved lower, softer, deeper underground. One morning while working in the shaft, I heard it again. Dozens of voices, echoing through tunnels of stone. It was impossible to tell where it came from, above, below, all around. The sound shimmered in the air like light trapped in darkness. Even the guards fell silent for a moment. That day, the mines didn't feel like graves. They felt like cathedrals. That night, Mikhail said quietly, "You notice how the songs come from the dying?" "Yes. Maybe they know something we don't." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a long time and said, "They've already stopped being afraid." I thought about that as I lay awake, listening to the faint hum drifting through the cold. The dying were teaching us how to live, not through words but through the courage to leave something beautiful behind. And in a world where everything was taken from us, that beauty was the only thing that truly belonged to us. When I die, I thought I will leave a story. A small one maybe, but mine. And perhaps someone somewhere will remember it, the way we remember Arvid's song. It came not with a shout but a whisper. One morning as we trudged toward the mines, someone in the back of the line murmured 4 words that changed everything. "Stalin is dying." No one looked up. No one dared reply. But the air shifted, subtly, invisibly, as if the wind itself had paused to listen. The rumor spread like smoke. By evening, every barrack knew. Men repeated it under their breath, not quite believing, afraid that even hope could be punished. At supper, Mikhail leaned close and whispered, "Where did it start?" "Mine 7, someone said. "A new prisoner." He heard from a guard. Said the old man's heart's failing. Another voice added, "They say Moscow's gone quiet." Then silence, that heavy, fearful silence that follows when you remember where you are. The guards shouted more that night as if trying to drown out the rumor with orders. But even they looked uneasy. Their boots struck the floor too hard, their glances lingered too long. In a place where everything was certain, your hunger, your exhaustion, your sentence, the idea that something might change was unbearable. Hope was dangerous here. It made you move differently, breathe differently. It made you forget to keep your eyes down. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the cracks like a voice calling from far away. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking of what it would mean if the man who had built these walls, this frozen empire of suffering, was truly mortal after all. The next morning we lined up for roll call. The guards' faces were tight, unreadable. No announcements, no speeches. But something had shifted. Their cruelty felt rehearsed, like actors repeating a role they no longer believed in. 3 days passed. Then came the official news. The entire camp was assembled in the yard, a sea of gray under the snow. The political officer stood before us, his voice flat, eyes blank. "Comrade Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet people, has died." A silence followed, not relief, not grief, just disbelief. No one dared react. To smile would be suicide. To mourn would be hypocrisy. So we stood motionless, faces carved from ice. But under that stillness, something electric moved. A breath, a tremor, a pulse. It was as if the frozen ground beneath us had cracked, just slightly, and something alive was stirring underneath. That night, the barracks hummed with whispers. What now? Will they release us? Will anything change? No one had answers. But for the first time in years, the questions themselves felt like breathing. Even the guards seemed unsure of their footing. They barked orders with less conviction. Their eyes darted toward the watchtower lights as if waiting for instructions that never came. I remember sitting beside Luca by the window. He was staring at the snow. "Do you think it's true?" he asked. "What?" "That a man like him can die." I thought about that for a long time. "Yes," I said finally. "Even monsters have hearts." He nodded slowly, then smiled. Not a happy smile, but the kind that comes from realizing the world might still be capable of surprise. That night, someone began humming one of Arvid's old songs. Soft, slow, almost reverent. Others joined, one by one, until the whole barack was vibrating with quiet sound. It wasn't celebration. It was something deeper. A mourning for the dead, not for Stalin but for all those who hadn't lived to see him die. When the song ended, I whispered to no one in particular. The snow will remember. And for the first time, I dared to think that maybe, just maybe, the world outside the wire had changed its breath too. The days after Stalin's death were unlike any we had known. The cold still cut the same, the hunger still gnawed, but something invisible had shifted. The guards spoke softer. The wind carried new rumors instead of orders. Freedom. The word itself felt dangerous, like holding fire in your hands. No one said it aloud, not at first. It lived in glances, in half-sentences, in the strange lightness of men who dared to imagine that the world might not stay frozen forever. "Did you hear?" whispered Mikhail one night. "They say in Moscow, there will be amnesty." Amnesty. I repeated the word as if testing it for poison. He nodded. "For the innocent. For mothers. For the wrongly accused." A bitter laugh escaped Taurus from the corner. "Then we'll all rot here." There are no innocents in the eyes of the party. But even he couldn't kill the spark that had begun to flicker. The next morning, something unusual happened. The foreman didn't shout. He looked at us, really looked, and said quietly, "Work carefully today. That's all." A few men froze, unsure if it was a trap. But the tone was different. For the first time, his words sounded human. By evening, rumors had multiplied. Prisoners in other camps released. Beria has been arrested. Trains moving west with empty cars. We didn't know what was true, but we talked about it anyway because talking made it real. Even lies felt like warmth. That night, we gathered in the dark and shared stories of what we would do if the gates opened. Pavel said he would walk straight to his son's school and wait outside until the boys saw him. Rain said he would swim in the Baltic even if it killed him. Luca smiled softly and said, "I would just like to sleep without dreaming of fences." When it was my turn, I hesitated. "I'd like to hear silence again," I said. "Not this kind, not the silence of fear. The real kind. The kind you find under trees or inside a church or in a lover's arms." They didn't laugh. They just nodded, each of us lost in the echo of our own dreams. Hope, I realized, was a kind of fever. It made men reckless, radiant, alive. And like all fevers, it was contagious. In the following weeks, small signs began to appear. Fewer punishments, longer rest breaks, slightly warmer soup. Tiny mercies, but we noticed every one. The guards avoided our eyes. They seemed uncertain, like actors whose script had been suddenly rewritten. We could sense it, they were afraid too. Afraid of change. Afraid of what we might become if we stopped fearing them. One afternoon, as we stood in line for rations, a young guard dropped his glove. Before he could bend to pick it up, Luca did, and handed it back. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then the guard whispered, "Good luck." No one else heard it, but Luca did. He told us that night, his voice trembling. I think they know it's ending." The next morning, as we marched to the mine, I noticed something extraordinary. The air smelled different, not of coal or smoke, but of wet earth. Spring. The first thaw. And for a moment, walking through that thin fog of melting snow, I felt something move inside me. Not joy, not peace, but the faint, almost forgotten pulse of freedom. It was just a whisper. But in a place where every whisper mattered, it was enough. Enough to keep walking. Enough to keep hoping. Enough to remind us that the world outside the wire might still remember our names. It began, as most revolutions do, with exhaustion. Not anger. Not courage. Just the simple, steady fatigue of men who had spent too long bowing their heads. By summer, the talk of amnesty had turned sour. Weeks passed, but no names were called, no trains arrived. The letters to families went unanswered. Hope, once so bright, began to flicker again. Yet something inside us had changed. We could not return to silence. One morning, as we marched toward the mines, Taurus whispered, "They're lying again. Nothing's coming. Nothing's changing." And I heard my own voice reply before I could stop it, "Then we'll make it change." He turned to me startled. It wasn't a plan, not yet. Just a thought spoken aloud. But thoughts, like sparks, are dangerous things in a world built of dry fear. That night, the barracks hummed with quiet conversation. Not stories this time. Plans. "What if we stop working?" Lucas said. All of us together. No violence. Just stop. Rain frowned. They'll shoot us. Maybe, Mikhail said. But maybe not if we stand as one. He looked at me. Alexander, you've studied history. Tell me, do men ever win by doing nothing? I hesitated. In the world out there? Sometimes. But here, I looked around at the faces glowing faintly in the candlelight. Here, doing nothing might be the loudest thing we can do. A silence followed. The kind that trembles with decision. In the days that followed, the idea spread like an ember catching old straw. Quietly, carefully, from bunk to bunk, mind to mind. We used our secret language. A hand brushed against a shoulder, a cough at the right time, a scrap of paper hidden in a loaf of bread. The word was simple. Wait. Wait for the day. Wait for the sign. When it came, no one would lift a shovel. Even those who didn't believe in change still agreed. Not out of hope, but out of dignity. We had been beaten, starved, frozen, but we could still refuse. Mikhail said it best one night. The guards think we're animals because animals obey hunger. But we still have the luxury of choice. Even a dying man can choose not to kneel. There was fear, of course. Always fear. But it felt different now. Sharper, cleaner. Like a blade turned outward instead of inward. One evening, as the northern light shimmered across the sky, Luca asked me quietly, "Do you think it will work?" I looked at him, his young face gaunt, his hands cracked and bleeding, and I said, "No. But that's not why we're doing it." He frowned. "Then why?" "So that they can never say we were silent." He nodded slowly. And that night, he drew a small circle in the air, our secret sign for hope. Others saw it and without a word copied the gesture. Dozens of invisible suns shining in the dark. That was when I realized it had already begun. The uprising hadn't started with refusal. It had started with remembering that we were still human enough to refuse. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but power. The quiet kind that lives between men who share the same truth, even if they never dare to speak it aloud. Storm was coming. And for once, it was ours. July 19th. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that swallows light whole. The guards shouted as always, but their voices sounded distant, like echoes from another world. I remember standing in line at roll call, my number hanging on my chest like a second skin. Around me, the men were quiet. Too quiet. Not fear this time. Something steadier. Something waiting. The bell rang. The gates opened. The workday began. We walked as always, boots scraping the frost, breath fogging the air, until we reached the mine entrance. Then, as the foreman barked orders, the man beside me set down his shovel. Another followed. Then another. The sound of tools hitting the ground was soft, but it spread like thunder through the ranks. In less than a minute, hundreds of us were standing still. No shouting. No slogans. Just silence. The foreman blinked, confused. "What are you doing?" "Pick them up. Work." No one moved. He turned to the guards. "They're refusing." A ripple went through the officers, anger, fear, disbelief. But still no one moved. That silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The commandant arrived, red-faced, trembling. "Who started this?" he demanded. No one answered. He screamed again, "Speak, or you'll all suffer." I don't know who did it first, maybe Taurus, maybe Rain, but someone began humming. Just a low, steady hum, the kind Arvid used to sing. Then others joined. And suddenly the mine yard was full of that deep, wordless sound. Not defiance, not prayer, but something between the two. The guards shouted themselves hoarse. One fired a warning shot into the sky. The echo rolled across the tundra, but still we stood. Finally, the commandant ordered the soldiers to retreat to the gates. He didn't know what else to do. We had broken the system without lifting a hand. By noon, the rumor had spread to the other mines. Entire brigades laid down their tools. Everywhere you looked, the same sight. Men standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, faces lifted toward the cold sun. For the first time in years, the work stopped. For the first time in years, the camp was ours. That night, no one spoke much. We sat by the stove, listening to the wind move through the cracks. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something purer. Something that made even the guards hesitate before shouting again. Mikhail looked at me and said softly, "Do you realize what we've done?" "Yes," I whispered. "We've reminded them we exist." He nodded, smiling faintly. That's enough for now. I lay awake long after lights out, my body aching from cold and hunger. But my mind was burning. For years we had been numbers, shadows, ghosts. Now for one single day we had been men again. And I knew even if the punishment came tomorrow, even if they crushed us completely, they would never unhear that silence. Because silence, once it has learned to speak, never forgets how. The first shot came at dawn. It cracked through the cold like thunder breaking glass. Then came another. And another. We were standing near Mine 29 when it happened. The heart of the strike, the place where the strongest had gathered. They had linked arms in a chain, 1,000 men shoulder to shoulder, facing the soldiers who surrounded them. No one shouted. No one ran. They just stood there, eyes steady, breath visible in the gray light. The commandant's voice echoed through the megaphone, trembling with anger and fear. You will return to work immediately. This is your final warning. No one moved. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of wind moving through the wire. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the line, a voice began to sing. It was Arvid's song, the one from months ago, soft and slow, about the sea and the sky. The men beside him joined in. Then the next row. Then the next. Until the whole yard trembled with it. A wall of sound so pure it made the soldiers hesitate. For one impossible second, I believed they might lower their rifles. Then the order came. Fire. The air exploded. The song broke. Bodies fell. Snow turned dark. I don't remember hearing the screams. Only the ringing, a high, hollow sound that lived in my ears for days. When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed felt wrong. Too large. Too heavy. The guards dragged the bodies away without ceremony. 60, maybe more. No one ever knew. By evening, their bunks were already empty, their names erased from the roll. But that night, no one slept. We sat in the dark, staring at the floor, the smell of blood still clinging to the wind. Someone whispered, "They've killed us." Mikhail shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "They've proven we were alive." In the following days, the camp changed. The guards spoke softer. The punishments grew fewer. The soup grew thicker. Tiny concessions, but we understood their meaning. They had broken the strike, yes. But in doing so, they had cracked something larger. The illusion that fear could rule forever. I remember going to the mine entrance a week later. The snow had melted just enough to reveal dark stains on the ground. I knelt, touched the frozen earth, and whispered the names of the men I could still remember. Not their numbers, their names. For a moment, I thought I heard their voices again, not singing, not crying, but breathing. The kind of breath that stays in the world long after the body is gone. That evening, Torres said something I never forgot. "They'll bury the bodies," he murmured, "but not the silence." He was right. The silence stayed. It filled every corner of the camp, every corridor, every mind. And within that silence lived something indestructible. The memory of a single morning when men chose to die standing rather than live on their knees. It wasn't victory, but it was immortality of another kind. Because long after the bullets stopped echoing, their song, our song, kept humming quietly beneath the snow. Spring came late that year. It crept in quietly, unsure if it was welcome. The snow melted in thin ribbons, the air smelled faintly of earth again, and the crows returned to the watchtowers before the guards even noticed. By then, the camp was different. Not freer, not yet, but softer somehow. The beatings were rarer. The guards' shouts felt half-hearted, as if even they had grown tired of pretending that the world would never change. Rumors came first, as always. Prisoners being released in Kolyma. Letters arriving from Moscow. Quotas reduced. Then one morning the loudspeaker crackled. The voice that followed was slow, uncertain, and unlike any we'd heard before. Certain sentences, it said, are to be reviewed. The men around me froze. No one spoke. Then Rain whispered, "It's happening." The words trembled like wings in the air. That night I couldn't sleep. I watched the ceiling as the light from the barack window flickered across it. The boards were still cracked, the smell still the same, smoke, sweat, metal, snow. But something beneath it all had shifted. We didn't know who would go home. We didn't even know if home still existed. But the thought that someone might, that this place might finally release even a single soul, was enough to make every breath feel new. A week later they read the first names. 15 men called from the line, trembling as if they might vanish. Their faces were impossible to describe, joy and terror mingled, as if the world beyond the wire were too large to imagine anymore. When the gates opened for them, no one cheered. We just stood there watching, memorizing every step. It felt sacred, not celebration but resurrection. That night, Tora said quietly, "Do you think they'll remember us?" I looked at him, the lines on his face, the frost on his beard, the steady eyes that had seen everything. "Yes," I said, "because we'll remind them." I didn't know if I would ever leave, but I knew this: I would carry their names, their songs, their stories. I would tell the world that in a place built to erase humanity, it was humanity that endured. The last morning I remember was clear. The air sharp but gentle. The horizon glowing with a light that seemed too bright for that place. It spilled over the wire, over the watchtowers, over the frozen ground where so many had fallen. I stood by the fence, my hand on the rusted metal, and for the first time I didn't feel trapped. The wire was still there, but somehow I was already beyond it. I whispered the promise we had all made: to remember, to speak, to tell, to make sure the silence never wins again. And as the sun climbed higher, I thought I saw them. Arvid, Luca, Mikhail, Rain, Taurus, walking ahead of me through the mist, their shadows long and light. Not ghosts, just men finally free. The light touched the snow, and for the first time in years, it didn't hurt to look at it. Sunrise epilogue, whispered to the listener: if you've come this far, then maybe you've walked with me through the cold. Maybe you've heard their voices in the silence too. When you close your eyes tonight, listen closely. Somewhere beyond the walls of time and frost, the camp still hums softly, not in pain but in memory, because even in the darkest places, humanity leaves a light, and that light, once seen, can never be buried again.